Howdy everyone. If you've ever had to talk politics with older conservative relatives at the Christmas table, then you know how it goes. The conversation starts off pretty tame, but it somehow turns to politics because the news is on the TV. Now, you're not too politically inclined, but you have some sort of common sense. You think everyone deserves human rights and people should be nice to one another. But then your grandfather says something that splits the room. Something sexist or racist or homophobic. Something like this. I just don't think the Mexicans/Muslims/foreigners/nebulously defined outgroup should come into our country and steal our jobs and women. And the silence allows you to think about whether or not to chip in. To heck with it. That's not smart, nor informed. There's nothing wrong with Mexicans/Muslims/foreigners/nebulously defined outgroups. They should be allowed to move to wherever they want. And they're not stealing our jobs and women. They're just earning the jobs we don't have the people to fill. And women aren't something to be stolen. They don't need protecting. They should be allowed to love who they want to. This is just some old-timey nonsense, and I don't think he should be believing that. So you decide to respond with that, and you give some pushback. Friendly but stern, and you challenge his notions of Mexicans/Muslims/foreigners/nebulously defined outgroups being bad people who are stealing from us quote-unquote true white British folk, or something like that. And after 2 minutes of heated debate, your grandfather says something to the tune of, "You young'uns with your do-gooder attitudes. Once you get older like me or your gran, you'll realise that nobody actually cares about you, everybody only cares about themselves. Real life isn't like those fantasy worlds in your kids' cartoons." And just as you're about to think of a response, your mum pops in and says, "I made a salad with craisins," and the conversation ends. You eat in silence for the next couple of minutes as everyone moves on with their lives. But the conversation sticks with you. How come he's just allowed to say something like that and everyone's fine with it? And all the things that you said don't sit with him. He just keeps on believing the things he just said. And the dismissal of your points was extremely rude. He thinks that his bigotry and uncaring attitude towards people going through hardship in general comes from his apparent wealth of experience in the world and not just existing and growing up in years where xenophobic and anti-black rhetoric was politically enforced very strongly. So why is all of this just glossed over? Why are people like this? How do you talk someone like this out of it? And how do you end up not turning into someone like that? Conservatism, as I've described here, is characterized largely by a wish to conserve things as they are right now, as they tend to be, or as they used to be. And older people who will have come into political sentience at the time of Nixon and Reagan, or at the time of Thatcher, Wilson and Heath, will have grown up on and have idolized rugged hyper-individualism as the major cultural influence in their life growing up. And this idea, with a small dash of a lot of racism added in, is going to be most likely what these conservatives want to conserve, and anything that challenges the world that they know is the enemy that's trying to take away their jobs and women with their progressive agenda or something. And I don't want to use a broad brush to paint everyone more right of me as selfish or anything. I've met some conservatives that don't squarely fit in this description, but the pattern is very much there and it's very strong as well. Conservatism is also about laziness. A lot of conservatives, older conservatives in particular, think of themselves as not very politically inclined nowadays, other than, of course, occasional musings at Fox or Sky News. Which just means that these people have, at this point in time at least, made peace with the establishment. This extends to the social, legal and political hierarchies and systems that are currently in place, like the prison-industrial complex, targeted voter suppression of non-white people, the wage gap, all of that jazz. They don't necessarily believe that those things are good, but they believe that nothing that they could feasibly do to better the world with regards to politics is worth the energy that they would put into it. Again, this isn't me trying to label every single conservative as a lazy, selfish do-nothing. There are a lot of conservatives that don't fit that label, I'm sure. But again, there is a strong correlation there. The number one obstacle to political awareness and activism is answering the question, how do you talk to someone who won't even listen to you? It's what the LGBT rights protests of the 80s and 90s were about. It's what the civil rights protests were about for the decades and centuries before that. It's what this channel is about. It's also the crux of the conversation you had in the hypothetical example at the beginning. You try to push back against his belief, and he dismisses you out of hand as lesser, as someone who hasn't experienced life enough to have opinions worth considering. And if I'm honest, I don't know if that's a question that can be reliably answered on an individual level. But that doesn't mean you can't try. And I'm not going to run down a detailed flowchart style list about whether your grandparents are reachable and if so, how to best reach them. But here on screen are a few general tips that might be useful if that's something you really want to try. To sway public opinion, you have to first gain public attention. But it's important to recognize that the main way that these people try to raise political awareness is through stochastic means, which basically just means they throw paint at the wall and see what sticks. Paint in this metaphor, of course, being exposure, and the wall in this metaphor being as many people as possible. You won't convince everyone, but if you act in the right way to enough people, you'll eventually convince the majority of people, probably. If not, you'll convince a sizable minority that will eventually be able to get stuff done. But ultimately, a lot of trying to appeal to older crowds is foreshadowed by the fact that the newer generations are unquestionably skewing more and more progressive, and more politically active as well. This is an issue that, if current data trends for the future can be believed, time will eventually solve. Now, this doesn't mean that any political aims should be foregone in favour of just waiting for these older people to die or something. In fact, most of the reason for that is the political awareness that I'm advocating for. But what it does mean is that all the effort is ultimately going to pay off someday.